All right, so a couple weeks ago on January 23rd, Joe Rogan recorded a podcast with Randall Carlson, who's a regular guest on the Joe Rogan Experience, but this was supposed to be a big episode because apparently Randall and this guy he's been working with for the past 7 years, we're going to go into detail about this rediscovered ancient technology that they claim exists, and they're in the process of rediscovering it, I guess. I don't know, but he did talk about it last time he was on Joe's podcast, and he didn't want to go into too much detail because he wanted to come back on and do a whole podcast on it, and he wanted to bring on the guy that's been working on the technology. And apparently they haven't been able to talk about it for the past 7 years because, of course, it's some secret operation that this guy's been working on, and they can't let the U.S. government know about it because they'll try to interfere. And he's been working in some lab on an island in South Asia. And you know, it all sounds cool. It sounds like the plot to a movie or something. And it would be awesome if somebody discovered some ancient technology and then unveiled it on the Joe Rogan Experience. But in reality, this is not looking too good. Or I guess maybe in some people's minds, the plot thickens here. But the recent podcast that Joe did with Randall Carlson and the guy who's been working on the technology, it looks like it's probably not going to be released. Randall said that Joe's delaying the podcast. And in my opinion, I don't think we see this podcast at all, unfortunately. You know, it's too bad because this probably would have been the best podcast in a while. And not because I think there's going to be some ancient technology revealed, but because I would have loved to see this guy try to show Joe and explain to him how this all works. And I'd love to see if Joe actually bought it or not. Or maybe Joe calls this guy out in his BS. I would have loved to see that. That would have been awesome. But odds are I feel like Joe probably didn't want to insult Randall by calling this guy out. And I'm sure after the podcast, or maybe before the podcast, Joe or Jamie did some research on this guy that Randall's been working with, Malcolm Bendall. He's the guy who claims to have invented this technology. And apparently there's even a blog post from Randall's friend who I guess was there while they recorded the podcast. And I guess this is what he had to say about it. He said, so on Monday, January 23rd, 2023, in the early afternoon, Joe recorded the darndest podcast I've ever heard. It was wild, and I would not blame the Joe Rogan Experience or Spotify one single bit if they check this guy out. I'm working on it too. So if you actually look into this guy just a little bit, Malcolm Bendall, I think is how you say his name, the guy who invented this technology, if you look into him a little bit, it's pretty clear this guy's bad news. If this is the right guy here, which it seems like it is, this article describes him as a wannabe oil baron who's been trying to convince people to give him money for the past 30 years to finance his oil operations in Tasmania, where he claims there's billions of dollars worth of oil, and he knows that because God told him, and now people claim they've been scammed by him. Like there's a guy that claims he lost his savings. He invested $280,000 into Malcolm's company, and he hasn't seen any of his money back. So this dude definitely seems sketchy, and he's just trying to take advantage of people by giving them these like grand ideas. And it seems like that's what he's doing to Randall now. And it sounds like Randall fell for it, hook, line, and sinker. He says he's been talking to this guy for 7 years, and he really believes that this guy reinvented some ancient technology. But if you spend like 5 seconds looking into him, he's a shady dude. Like, it does not sound like this guy's trying to actually help you with anything. It sounds like he's just trying to get money from you or use you to get on the Joe Rogan Experience, and he's just trying to make money. And he probably noticed how excited Randall was about this and how much he wanted to believe in it. So he just comes along and tells Randall everything he wants to hear, and next thing you know, he's on the Joe Rogan Experience. So like I said, last time Randall was on Joe's podcast, he was on there with Graham Hancock, and he briefly mentioned this technology, and it did sound cool. And it was interesting to hear about and think like maybe there's a possibility of it, but there's so many red flags.
Now, I mean, some modern researchers whose work has been buried or suppressed, I think we're getting very close to rediscovering some of the things that our ancient ancestors were up to. And maybe this would be worth a whole show in itself. We could dive into this, and I don't want to get into that today.
But what kind of technologies are you talking about?
Well, I shouldn't really get into that.
Get into it.
Get into
Come
it,
on.
Randall.
We got to get into it.
Okay, well.
We've opened the door, sir.
Okay. Well, okay. There are people out there now who have been working on trying to rediscover. There are people who've been working on these things for decades now, basically in secret. In secret. And I've had the privilege of talking to some of these people over the last 6 or 7 years. And right now, as we're speaking, there's a group of people who are basically going to open source a whole lot of stuff in the next 3 months. so it can never get suppressed again. And that's why I'd like to come back and talk in more
Well, I'd
detail.
love to have you come back and talk about it, but we got to talk about it a little bit now.
Yeah, so listening to this, knowing who the modern researcher is that Randall is referring to, is just kind of sad because he's been talking to this guy for 7 years and he's probably so excited about this and everything, but it's not looking too good. And, I hope I'm wrong. I'd love to see somebody show up and expose this crazy technology that no one's ever seen before. But if the guy who claimed to have invented this technology is the same guy who went looking for oil and took a bunch of money from people because he claimed God told him to, I don't know if I'm going to trust that guy. So now Randall pulls up this presentation that this guy Malcolm put together. And I will admit, this thing looks kind of cool. Whatever this is, this plasmoid unification model, I don't know what the hell that means, but it looks badass. And if somebody shows me this, I'm thinking, you got to be onto something, right? No, I'm just kidding. But it does look cool. And it looks like somebody put a lot of time and effort into it. So I don't know. I hope I'm wrong. But right now, I'm obviously very skeptical. But again, it does all sound cool. Like when they start talking about it here and how they think in ancient civilization, they used to use noise frequencies to move bricks to help build pyramids. And their theory is that technology is wiped out and now nobody knows about it. But apparently they're rediscovering it right now. And the other day is supposed to be revealed on the Joe Rogan Experience.
There's a laboratory right now in the Maldives that's been building prototypes using these technological principles.
We're looking at technologies that are not the same as ours.
Yes.
And that's
Yes,
partly
that's the
why
point.
archaeologists can't see them, because they're looking for us in the past, and they're not open to the possibility that there are whole other kinds of technology that could be used.
Right.
I always go back to the ancient Egyptian traditions that speak of priests chanting as these huge blocks were lifted into the air. Were they using some kind of sound effect, some kind of use of sound that was able to manipulate matter? We know that sound can manipulate matter, as a matter of fact, but they're lifting these blocks. Again and again, it appears in ancient Egyptian traditions. The notion that we could lift huge blocks with sound seems absurd to archaeologists, and yet it's there in the traditions of the Egyptologists.
This was the inspiration. His work was suppressed. A lot of his patents were taken, sealed up by the U.S. government. For whatever reason, I don't know. But this is some of the stuff that's now being developed using his ideas, plus some of the others. This is the man I've been talking to for the last 7 years.
Malcolm Bendall?
Yes. And again, I don't want to get into it today, but here's an example of what they're doing. This is a generator that has no moving parts. It's all based on geometry. And it's all based upon the ancient numbers. And they're developing technologies right now, and they have been. I was recently contacted and given the go-ahead that I could talk. I've been sitting on this for 7 years without talking about it because they asked me not to talk about it until they had their patents in place and their licensing. That's all happened since last summer. So we're now free to talk about it. So that's what I'm saying. I think it would be a good idea to get me back on here. We can look at it.
Whoa,
Yeah.
what is all this?
Well, this is the model. And this is diagramming all the frequencies of the elements and what their vibrational frequencies are and the numbers that measure those frequencies. And they're all the numbers we get from looking at these ancient traditions that recur over and over and over again, that I've been talking about in my sacred geometry classes for decades without knowing what the final result was going to be. This inventor who's working with this small group contacted me, and this is what he told me. He said, you built the foundation. He said, you laid the foundation with your work on ancient geometry, and I built a house on top of it. That's what he said.
Nice.
So for 7 years, he's been supplying me with all the information. I have copies of all the patents. I have videos.
Yeah, so unfortunately, life just isn't that interesting. I mean, people always want to imagine that there's some crazy magical thing out there that people are trying to hide from us, and it's finally going to come to light. But in reality, it never does. And Joe's been trying to dig for this kind of stuff for a while now. He used to do that show, Joe Rogan Questions Everything. Now he's doing that, but just with a podcast where he talks to more legit people. But a lot of it is just so far out there. Like, if you read some of the text from this guy's presentation, it sounds insane. Like, I don't think there's any legit science going on here. But also, I don't really know what I'm talking about. It's not like I really could understand any of this kind of stuff anyways. But just from everything here, there are so many red flags. And it's funny because for some people, these red flags just make it seem more legit. Like the fact that Joe isn't going to air that podcast, or he might not, there still is a possibility that he airs it, but it seems like he's not going to. I'm sure a lot of conspiracy theorists will be like, oh, Spotify and Joe, they don't want this information out there. Like he showed this groundbreaking technology and there's no way they could air this because it would just blow people's minds and the government would stop him and all this crazy stuff. But in reality, they brought on some guy that is a grifter and he embarrassed himself, and now they just don't want to air it because it's embarrassing for all of them, unfortunately. But we'll see. Maybe I am wrong. I hope I am. I'd love to see some crazy technology here, but it's just not looking like it. So I guess we'll have to wait and see if Joe puts out a statement or addresses it on another podcast. All right, so that's about it for this video. Make sure to leave me a comment. Let me know what you think about all this. Let me know if you think this technology is legit and maybe the globalists got to Joe before he could release the podcast and they shut it down because they don't want this information out there. And now maybe they're paying me to try to discredit this guy. All right, so let me know what you guys think. And if you want more content, if you want to hear about Joe's dad who's trying to extort him for a bunch of money right now, I talked about it on my Patreon, so make sure you check that out. And then hit the like button here, and I'll catch you at the next video.